Invisible Hands, Episode 4, The Dark Empath, When Insight Doesn't Mean Care. Hello, and welcome back to Invisible Hands, Series, Manipulation, Power, and the Fracture of Perception. Before we begin, take a moment to slow the pace of listening. This episode isn't designed to provoke urgency, alertness, or vigilance. It isn't a warning, and it isn't a revelation. It's an invitation to notice something subtle, something that often goes unnamed precisely because it doesn't arrive with obvious harm. If you're listening while doing something else, that's fine. There's nothing here that requires sharp focus or emotional intensity. The material unfolds gradually. You don't need to agree with it, and you don't need to decide what it means yet. Just let it arrive. Some of what we'll explore may feel familiar. Some of it may feel quietly unsettling, not because it's extreme, but because it sits close to experiences that are often described as almost fine, mostly okay, or hard to explain. This episode doesn't ask you to confront anyone, label anyone, or reassess your past in dramatic terms. It asks something gentler, and in some ways more difficult. To notice the difference between being understood and being held. What this episode is and is not before we go any further, it's important to clarify what this episode is not. This is not an attack on empathy. It is not a dismissal of sensitivity, intuition, or emotional awareness. It is not a diagnosis, a category, or a label meant to be applied to people. And it is not an attempt to popularize or reinforce internet psychology. We're not here to name a new type of person. We're here to examine a pattern, one that becomes visible when empathy is treated as a capacity rather than an ethic. This episode is not asking whether empathy is real or valuable. That question has already been answered many times over. Empathy matters, sensitivity matters, emotional intelligence matters. What this episode asks instead is quieter and more uncomfortable. What happens when insight exists without responsibility? What happens when someone can see, sense, and understand another person clearly, but is not bound by care for their well-being? And why does that particular combination feel so confusing to the people on the receiving end? Why this topic needs careful consideration. The phrase Dark Empath has gained traction because it tries to name something people struggle to articulate. It emerges from experiences where someone says, often in disbelief, they really understood me, and yet something was wrong. Not chaotic, not obviously cruel, not overtly manipulative, just wrong in a way that's difficult to explain. Many people who use this term aren't trying to demonize others. They're trying to reconcile a contradiction, the experience of being deeply seen, alongside the experience of being subtly harmed, disregarded, or left unprotected. That contradiction doesn't fit neatly into familiar categories. So this episode doesn't try to validate the term as a diagnosis, and it doesn't dismiss the experience as confusion or projection. Instead, we slow the phenomenon down and look at what's actually happening underneath it. How this episode fits the series. In the earlier episodes of Invisible Hands, we've been building a map, not of people, but of how influence works. Episode 1 focused on mechanisms, how manipulation operates regardless of intent. Episode 2 explored the narcissistic pattern, validation-seeking dynamics that create confusion and instability. Episode 3 examined power without conscience, instrumental harm that functions cleanly, logically, and without emotional engagement. This episode continues that progression. If Episode 3 explored what happens when power is separated from feeling, Episode 4 explores what happens when feeling is separated from care. That distinction matters, because empathy, unlike power or dominance, is widely assumed to be safe. And that assumption is where much of the confusion begins. Empathy is not a moral guarantee. One of the quiet assumptions we carry, culturally and relationally, is that empathy protects us. If someone is empathic, we assume they won't harm us, they'll care about our impact, and they'll feel something if they cause damage. But empathy by itself does not create obligation, it creates access. Access to emotional states, access to vulnerabilities, access to patterns of fear, hope, longing, and attachment. Whether that access is used to protect, support, or constrain harm depends on something else entirely. And that something else is care. Care introduces limits. Care introduces responsibility. Care binds insight to accountability. Without care, empathy becomes a tool, not a bond. Why this pattern is so difficult to name? When people describe harm that comes from volatility, confusion, or overt control, it's easier to trust their experience. But harm that comes from accurate attunement is harder to recognize. There's often no chaos, no contradiction, no obvious manipulation. In fact, things may feel unusually clear, and clarity can be reassuring, especially after confusion. This is why people often doubt themselves in these situations. They ask, if something was wrong, wouldn't I feel more distressed? If they understood me so well, how could it be harmful? Maybe I'm misinterpreting this. This episode takes that self-doubt seriously, not as a flaw, but as a predictable response to a pattern that doesn't trigger our usual warning signs. Sensitivity without ethics. The core distinction this episode rests on is simple, but easily overlooked. Empathy allows someone to see you. Care requires someone to hold themselves accountable for what they see. Sensitivity, insight, and emotional intelligence can exist independently of ethics, and when they do, they increase influence, not safety. This doesn't make someone evil. It doesn't require malicious intent, and it doesn't mean harm is inevitable. But it does mean there are fewer internal constraints, and influence without constraint has consequences even when it looks gentle, reasonable, or caring on the surface. What this episode will explore, over the course of this episode, we'll explore why the experience of being accurately read can feel like safety, how attunement lowers defenses at a physiological level, the difference between empathy as perception and care as responsibility, how insight becomes influence when power asymmetries are present, and why this pattern is often recognized only after someone feels diminished, narrowed, or quietly overridden. We'll stay grounded. There will be no checklists, no labels to apply, and no instructions for confrontation. The aim is not to identify people, it's to restore internal reference points. A guiding line for this episode. If there's a single line to hold as we move forward, it's this. Being understood is not the same as being safe. This episode isn't about withdrawing trust from empathy. It's about noticing what accompanies empathy and what doesn't. With that orientation in place, we can begin. In the first section, we'll look at why the idea of the dark empath emerged at all, not as a myth and not as a diagnosis, but as an attempt to name an experience that didn't fit existing language. Not to validate the term, but to understand the gap it's trying to fill. We'll start there. Section 1, how the experience takes shape. The experience this episode is concerned with rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as a rupture or a warning. It does not feel like danger. In fact, one of its defining qualities is how quietly reassuring it can be in the beginning. There is no obvious harm to react against, no sharp edge to pull away from. What people often notice first is something closer to relief. Someone seems to understand them. Not in the generic way of polite listening or surface agreement, but in a way that feels accurate, nuanced, precise. Emotional states are reflected cleanly. Reactions are anticipated without being asked for. Things that have been difficult to articulate are named with surprising ease. For many, this kind of recognition is unfamiliar. It can feel grounding, especially for those who are used to being misunderstood, overlooked, or required to explain themselves repeatedly. There is often a sense of coherence that emerges in these early interactions, a feeling that conversation flows more easily, that tension softens, that effort drops away. At this stage, nothing feels wrong, and importantly, nothing is wrong as yet. The nervous system responds quickly to accurate attunement. When another person mirrors internal states, tone, pacing, and emotional cadence, the body interprets this as a reduction in threat. Muscles relax, speech becomes more fluid. Attention settles. The internal vigilance that often accompanies social interaction begins to quiet. This response does not depend on conscious trust or evaluation. It happens beneath deliberation. The body relaxes before the mind has decided anything. That relaxation is often mistaken for safety. But safety and threat reduction are not the same thing. Threat reduction simply means the system no longer feels the need to defend itself. Safety requires something more enduring: protection, consistency, and responsibility for impact over time. In the early stages of this experience, those distinctions are not yet visible. What is visible is clarity. Conversations make sense. Emotional responses feel understood. Explanations are coherent. There is often less confusion than people are accustomed to in relational dynamics, and because confusion has been culturally coded as a warning sign, its absence is taken as reassurance. As the interaction continues, the attunement remains, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, it begins to acquire direction. Not through persuasion and not through pressure, but through framing. Interpretations are offered that align closely with the listener's inner landscape. Emotional responses are contextualized in ways that feel plausible precisely because they fit what is already known. Nothing here feels like influence. It feels like understanding, and understanding, when it is accurate, is trusted. Over time, a subtle shift can occur, not in behavior that is easy to point to, but in where reference begins to live. The listener may start checking the other person's reactions before fully trusting their own. They may adjust expression or emphasis to maintain coherence. Interpretations are accepted because they feel aligned, not because they are imposed. This does not feel like submission. It feels like alignment. Alignment is socially rewarded. It creates ease. It reduces friction. It allows interaction to continue smoothly. The attunement continues, sometimes deepening. Emotional states are still read accurately. Vulnerabilities are still recognized. Sensitivities are noticed. Patterns are anticipated. But when impact appears, when something said lands sharply, or when a boundary is crossed, something subtle is missing. The response may be calm, reasonable, even empathetic in tone. There may be an explanation without repair, recognition without adjustment. Insight is offered, but no sustained accountability for how that insight is used. This is often the first point where dissonance begins to register. Not confusion exactly, more like an absence, a sense that something expected did not occur. It can be difficult to articulate what that something is, because nothing overtly negative has happened. There has been no obvious harm, no raised voices, no dramatic rupture. Instead, there is a growing awareness that while one is being accurately read, one is not being protected by that knowledge. The attunement remains, the care does not deepen. Because attunement usually signals care, this mismatch is hard to detect. The nervous system has already relaxed. The body already associates this interaction with reduced threat. Discernment, which relies on contrast and friction, has less information to work with. When people begin to feel unsettled in this way, they rarely question the other person first. They question themselves. They wonder whether they are being overly sensitive, whether they are misreading the situation, whether the discomfort is a projection or a personal issue. After all, if someone understands them this well, surely harm would be intentional, and nothing intentional seems to be happening. This self-questioning is not a failure of perception. It is a logical attempt to reconcile conflicting signals. The body feels seen. The mind feels slightly diminished. Faced with that contradiction, the mind often assumes it must be at fault. Over time, the internal response becomes more noticeable. People may find themselves speaking less freely, editing thoughts before expressing them, feeling a subtle contraction after interactions, a need to withdraw or reset without being able to explain why. These are not dramatic shifts. They are small, accumulative adjustments, easy to dismiss individually, harder to ignore when they begin to form a pattern. What makes this experience particularly destabilizing is that it lacks the features people are taught to associate with harm. There is no obvious manipulation, no volatility, no chaos. In fact, things may feel unusually calm and orderly. Clarity remains, and clarity can be persuasive. Language in these dynamics is often careful and reasonable. Phrases are delivered with a calm tone and apparent sincerity. Nothing sounds aggressive. Nothing feels overtly coercive. Words are chosen well. But language here functions less as communication and more as stabilization. It keeps the surface smooth. It reduces disruption. It maintains influence without requiring adjustment. The body continues to comply, not because it has chosen to, but because it has learned that coherence and attunement reduce internal friction. This is often recognized only in hindsight. Distance, emotional, physical, or contextual, creates space for reflection. People look back and realize that something shifted gradually without a clear moment of consent, that they adapted more than they intended, that they trusted interpretations that quietly displaced their own. There is often grief in this recognition, not because of what was taken, but because of how quietly it happened. There was no clear point to object to, no obvious event to mark, just a gradual erosion of internal reference. The term that sometimes emerges, dark empath or something like it, usually arrives after this retrospective clarity. It is an attempt to name an experience that felt contradictory, being seen without being held, understood without being protected. This episode does not validate that label as an explanation. It treats it as a signal, a sign that language is being asked to account for a gap that has not yet been clearly described. What matters here is not the name, but the process that makes such naming attempts necessary. A process where insight exists without care, where attunement is accurate but unconstrained, where influence grows in the absence of responsibility. If any of this feels familiar, it is important to hold that recognition gently. This is not about blame toward others or toward oneself. It is about understanding how certain relational patterns take shape without malice, without drama, and without obvious warning signs. In the next section, this will be slowed down further by looking at empathy itself, not as a virtue or identity, but as a capacity that can operate in very different ways depending on what accompanies it. Not to categorize people, but to restore clarity about what empathy can and cannot guarantee. Section 2. Empathy has types, and they don't all protect. Empathy is often spoken about as though it were a single quality, a unified trait that either exists or does not. Someone is empathic or they are not. Someone has empathy, and that possession is assumed to carry ethical weight with it, care, restraint, responsibility, and protection bundled together. But empathy does not function as a single thing. It is not a moral guarantee, it is not an ethic, and it does not by itself bind behavior. What empathy does is provide access to emotional states, access to inner worlds, access to the contours of another person's experience. What happens with that access depends on what accompanies it. This section slows that distinction down, not to categorize people, and not to turn empathy into a checklist, but to restore clarity around something that is often conflated. Because when empathy is treated as inherently protective, people are left vulnerable to forms of influence that don't look like harm, don't feel like threat, and don't activate the warning systems they've learned to trust. Empathy can operate at the level of understanding. This is the capacity to accurately perceive another person's emotional state, motivations, fears, and internal logic. It is often precise, sometimes uncannily so. It allows someone to anticipate reactions, to predict responses, to name feelings before they are spoken. This kind of empathy is often described as being perceptive or emotionally intelligent. It is highly valued in leadership, negotiation, counseling, and social navigation. It creates the impression of depth and attunement, and it can feel validating to be on the receiving end of it, especially for people who are used to being misread. But understanding does not require emotional resonance. One can understand another person's fear without feeling it. One can map another person's vulnerabilities without being moved by them. One can recognize patterns without being ethically bound to how those patterns are handled. Understanding is a form of cognition. It lives in perception and analysis. It allows someone to say accurately, I see what's happening inside you, but it does not, on its own, answer the question of what should happen next. There is another form of empathy that involves emotional resonance, the capacity to feel with another person, to experience an echo of their emotional state in one's own body. This is often what people imagine when they think of empathy as kindness or care. Effective empathy brings sensation. It brings discomfort when another is in pain. It brings warmth when another is at ease. Because it involves felt experience, it is often assumed to be morally safer. If someone feels what you feel, surely they wouldn't cause you harm. But even this assumption is unstable. Feeling with someone does not automatically produce responsibility. It can intensify connection without introducing limits. It can create closeness without constraint. It can deepen influence without ensuring protection. Effective empathy can coexist with self-interest. It can coexist with avoidance. It can coexist with a lack of accountability. Feeling something does not obligate action, and it certainly does not obligate restraint. Then there is a third element, often assumed rather than named, compassion. Compassion is not simply feeling or understanding. It is the willingness to take responsibility for impact. It introduces constraint into behavior. It asks not only what do I see or what do I feel, but what does this require of me? Compassion is slower, it is less glamorous. It often involves limitation rather than expression. Where empathy provides access, compassion introduces obligation. It says, if I know this about you, then there are things I will not do. If I recognize this vulnerability, then there are boundaries I must honor. If my actions affect you in this way, then I am responsible for adjusting. This is why compassion is rarer than empathy. It requires self-restraint. It requires ethical friction. It requires someone to limit their own influence, even when they could extend it. Empathy does not require that. The confusion that gives rise to the experience described in this episode often emerges when these elements are conflated, when understanding is mistaken for care, when emotional accuracy is assumed to carry ethical weight, when feeling seen is interpreted as being held. This confusion is understandable because in many relational contexts, these elements do travel together. In healthy bonds, empathy and compassion reinforce each other. Insight is paired with responsibility. Attunement deepens care, but they are not inseparable. And when they come apart, the resulting dynamic can feel uniquely disorienting. In the experiences people struggle to name, the empathy present is often accurate and refined. Emotional states are recognized clearly. Inner conflicts are articulated with precision. Vulnerabilities are noticed rather than overlooked. This accuracy is compelling. It creates trust not through promises, but through recognition. It reduces the sense of being alone inside one's experience. And because being seen is a fundamental human need, the nervous system responds quickly. But when this empathy is not accompanied by compassion, by responsibility for impact, something subtle begins to erode. There may be no overt harm, no obvious cruelty, no dramatic misuse of power. Instead, there is a lack of constraint. The insight remains available. The access remains open, but nothing limits how that access is used. This is where people often get stuck. They look for intent. They look for malice. They look for emotional coldness. And when they don't find it, they doubt their own experience. After all, the other person seems to understand them. They may even express feelings about what's happening. They may sound concerned, thoughtful, or reflective, but concern without accountability is not protection. Feeling without adjustment is not caring. Empathy can coexist with harm when nothing requires it to stop. It's important to be precise here because this is not an argument that empathy is dangerous. It is an argument that empathy is powerful, and that power without constraint is ethically neutral at best. Empathy increases influence, it lowers defenses, it invites disclosure, it deepens access to internal states. This can be used to support, protect, and repair. It can also be used to steer, shape, or stabilize outcomes. The difference lies not in the presence of empathy, but in what governs its use. One of the reasons this pattern is so difficult to recognize is that empathy is culturally coded as good. It is praised, encouraged, held up as evidence of maturity and emotional health. So when empathy is present, people assume safety. They relax, they open, they defer. And when harm follows, subtle, cumulative, and unannounced, they are unprepared to interpret it. The body has already learned that this interaction reduces threat. By the time discernment reactivates, the pattern may be established. Another reason this is difficult to name is that compassion is often invisible. Empathy is expressive. It shows up in language, tone, and recognition. It is easy to point to. Compassion shows up in restraint, in what doesn't happen, in boundaries honored quietly. It is harder to notice until it's absent. When compassion is present, there are moments where insight leads to limitation, where someone chooses not to press a point, not to enter a vulnerability, not to use what they know to advance their own position. When compassion is absent, insight flows freely and influence expands without resistance. This does not require intention. It does not require planning. It does not require cruelty. It requires only the absence of an internal break. People often try to resolve this by asking whether someone really cares. But care, in this sense, is not a feeling. It is a pattern of behavior over time. Care shows up in consistency, in accountability, in repair that is not conditional on being understood. Care limits power. Empathy increases it. Without care, empathy becomes asymmetrical. Without responsibility, insight becomes leverage. This distinction helps explain why people can feel deeply seen and yet slowly diminished. Why can they experience clarity in conversation but contraction afterwards? Why can one trust someone's understanding while losing trust in themselves? The issue is not misreading. It is not deception. It is not pathology. It is a mismatch between access and obligation. Understanding someone's inner world does not obligate protection. This sentence can feel jarring because many people live as though the opposite were true. They assume that if someone knows how something affects them, that knowledge will automatically be handled with care. But knowledge does not bind behavior. Ethics do, and ethics are not guaranteed by perception. This is where many people experience a quiet grief. They realize they have been relying on empathy as a proxy for safety. They have trusted attunement rather than accountability. They have equated recognition with responsibility. That reliance makes sense. It is adaptive. It is human. But it leaves people vulnerable in environments where empathy is present without care, particularly in contexts where influence is rewarded and constraint is not. This section does not offer an evaluation rule. It is not suggesting people withdraw trust from empathy altogether. It is restoring a missing distinction. Empathy tells you what someone can see. Compassion tells you what they will protect. And those two things do not always travel together. In the next section, this distinction will be placed in context. We'll look at how insight functions when attachment is absent, how attunement can remain accurate while responsibility quietly drops away, not to assign blame, but to understand how influence expands when nothing limits it. Section 3, Insight without attachment. There is a common assumption woven quietly into how people understand connection, that insight leads naturally to attachment, and that attachment carries responsibility with it. If someone can read emotional states accurately, if they are attuned to tone, mood, and inner conflict, then they must also be invested in the well-being of the person they are reading. This assumption is rarely questioned because in many healthy relationships it holds true. Insight and attachment develop together. Recognition deepens care. Attunement strengthens responsibility. But they are not the same thing. And when they separate, the resulting dynamic can be difficult to recognize, not because it is dramatic, but because it is clean. Insight without attachment does not feel chaotic. It does not feel volatile. It does not feel unsafe in the way people expect harm to feel. People can read emotional states accurately for many reasons. Some have learned to do so because they grew up in environments where sensitivity was necessary for survival. Others developed it through professional roles that require emotional navigation, counseling, leadership, mediation, and care work. Some possess a natural perceptiveness, an ability to notice microshifts in tone, posture, pacing, or effect. This capacity can be refined, it can become sharp, it can operate quickly and quietly, and crucially, it does not require attachment. Attunement is a perceptual skill, attachment is a relational bond. They overlap often, but they are not dependent on one another. Attunement allows someone to notice when another person is anxious before they speak, to sense when a boundary is forming or when it is about to collapse, to detect ambivalence, longing, hesitation, or compliance in real time. This sensitivity can look like care because it produces comfort. It reduces friction. It allows conversations to unfold smoothly. It helps the other person feel understood, mirrored, and less alone. But attunement by itself does not require that the other person's well-being be prioritized. It only requires perception. Attachment, on the other hand, introduces vulnerability. It binds one person's internal state to another's outcomes. When attachment is present, harm carries weight. Impact matters. There is an internal cost to causing distress, even unintentionally. Without attachment, insight remains free. Free to observe, free to respond, free to disengage, and free to continue without repair. This distinction helps explain why some experiences feel so destabilizing in hindsight. People often say they were not misread. Their emotions were not dismissed or denied. In fact, they were often described with striking accuracy. What was missing was not understanding, it was holding. To hold someone is to allow their experience to place limits on your behavior. It means that knowing something about them obligates you to act differently than you otherwise might. Insight without attachment carries no such obligation. When sensitivity functions primarily as perception rather than connection, it becomes directional rather than reciprocal. The attuned person remains centered in themselves. They do not need the bond to continue in order to regulate their own state. This creates an asymmetry. One person feels seen and settles into the interaction. The other remains unbound. The interaction continues smoothly because nothing disrupts it. There is no internal pressure to adjust, repair, or constrain influence. From the outside, this often looks like maturity, calmness, emotional intelligence. The absence of reactivity can be mistaken for stability, but emotional non-reactivity is not the same as emotional investment. This is where the phrase often emerges internally. They didn't misunderstand me. People replay conversations and realize that their feelings were named correctly. Their motives were recognized. Their vulnerabilities were not overlooked. And yet, something essential was missing. The absence of misunderstanding becomes part of the confusion, because misunderstanding is what people expect to find when harm occurs. Recognition without responsibility feels different from neglect or dismissal. It does not trigger the same defenses. It does not provoke anger in the same way. Instead, it produces doubt. If they understood me, why do I feel smaller after this? If they saw what mattered to me, why didn't that change anything? These questions are difficult to answer when insight has been present. Bonding introduces friction. It complicates influence. It requires negotiation between one person's needs and another's. It creates moments where someone must choose between advancing an outcome and preserving a relationship. When attachment is absent, that friction disappears. Insight can be applied cleanly. Responses can be calibrated precisely. Outcomes can be shaped without internal conflict. This efficiency can be mistaken for clarity. One of the reasons this pattern persists unnoticed is that it does not generate chaos. In fact, it often reduces it. Conversations remain coherent. Emotional expression is contained. Disruption is minimal. The attuned person does not need to dominate or overpower. They simply remain unbound by what they perceive. This makes the dynamic difficult to challenge, because there is no obvious point of rupture. Over time, the person on the receiving end may begin to adapt, not consciously and not as a strategy, but as a response to subtle cues. They may notice that certain expressions elicit smoother responses than others, that certain needs are acknowledged but not accommodated, that certain vulnerabilities are met with understanding but not protection. Gradually, expression becomes selective. This is not because anyone has demanded compliance. It is because the body learns what maintains coherence. This adaptation is often misinterpreted as mutuality. It feels like cooperation. It feels like alignment. And because it reduces friction, it is often rewarded socially, professionally, and relationally. But alignment that requires one person to contract is not bonding. It is an accommodation. The difference between attunement and bonding becomes clearer when strain appears. When there is pressure, or conflict, or a need for repair, attachment reveals itself through effort, through willingness to adjust, through discomfort taken on in the service of the relationship. Where attachment is absent, insight remains intact, but nothing moves. There may be an explanation, there may be a reflection, there may be recognition of impact, but there is no sustained change. This is where people often feel a sense of quiet abandonment, not because the other person has left, but because the relationship does not respond to strain in a way that preserves mutuality. The bond does not deepen, the dynamic does not soften, the attunement does not translate into care. And because everything still makes sense intellectually, this absence is easy to rationalize away. Recognition without responsibility has a particular effect on self-trust. When someone understands you but does not hold you, the mind looks for reasons. It assumes that understanding should lead to care, so when care does not appear, the explanation is often internalized. Perhaps the need was unreasonable. Perhaps the impact was overstated. Perhaps the expectation of protection was misplaced. This self-questioning is reinforced by the other person's calmness. Their coherence becomes evidence against your perception. After all, if they are so clear and so reasonable, how could harm be occurring? This is one of the most subtle injuries in this pattern, the erosion of epistemic trust. Not trust in the other person, but trust in one's own perception. People stop asking, is this good for me? They start asking, am I interpreting this correctly? And that shift matters. Sensitivity without attachment allows someone to remain present without being implicated. They can witness emotion without being shaped by it. They can recognize distress without altering course. This does not require cruelty. It does not require malice. It does not require intent. It requires only the absence of relational consequence. The anchor line for this episode sits here for a reason. They didn't misunderstand you. They simply didn't hold you. That distinction reframes the entire experience. It removes the need to search for deception or denial. It explains why clarity coexisted with contraction. It accounts for why the experience felt real but incomplete. Holding someone does not mean absorbing their pain or sacrificing oneself. It means allowing their experience to place limits on your freedom to act. Insight without attachment keeps all options open. Attachment closes some, and that closing is what creates safety. This section is not an argument for deeper attachment in every context. Not all relationships require bonding. Not all interactions call for care. But when empathy is interpreted as a signal of safety, and attachment is assumed where it does not exist, people are left exposed. They trust insight where responsibility is absent. In the next section, we will look at what happens when empathy itself becomes a tool, not through manipulation or intent, but through the simple fact that insight increases influence when nothing constrains its use. Not to warn, but to understand how power grows quietly in relational spaces that appear benign. Section 4. When empathy becomes a tool, empathy, when discussed as a human capacity, is usually framed as a bridge, something that closes distance, softens conflict, and allows people to meet one another with greater understanding. It is associated with kindness, maturity, and emotional depth. In most cultural narratives, empathy is positioned as a corrective force, the thing that prevents harm. But empathy also increases influence. This is not a moral claim, it is a functional one. When someone can accurately perceive another person's emotional state, internal logic, fears, hopes, and attachment patterns, they gain information that has directional potential. That information can be used to support and protect. It can also be used to steer, regulate, or stabilize outcomes, often without the person on the receiving end realizing that influence is taking place. Empathy does not become a tool because it is weaponized. It becomes a tool because it works. The moment empathy begins to function instrumentally is rarely obvious. It does not arrive with manipulation or coercion. It arrives through fluency, through responsiveness, through the subtle ease that comes from being accurately read. When someone understands how another person responds to approval, tension, silence, warmth, or uncertainty, they can predict reactions with a high degree of accuracy. Prediction does not require intent. It is simply the byproduct of pattern recognition. Once reactions are predictable, outcomes become steerable. This steering does not need to be overt. In fact, it is most effective when it remains invisible, when it feels like mutual understanding rather than influence. Empathy lowers defenses because it reduces uncertainty. When people feel misunderstood, the nervous system remains vigilant. There is effort in explaining oneself, clarifying intent, and correcting misinterpretations. That effort keeps discernment active. When people feel understood, effort drops away. They speak more freely. They disclose more readily. They relax internal boundaries. This relaxation is not a choice. It is a physiological response to reduced threat. And once defenses are lower, influence requires less force. This is why empathy paired with power asymmetry carries particular weight. Power asymmetry does not require hierarchy in the formal sense. It can emerge through context, role, dependency, expertise, authority, or emotional positioning. Wherever one person's outcomes depend more heavily on another's responses, asymmetry exists. When empathy enters such a space, it magnifies that asymmetry. The person with more power gains access not only to information, but to leverage, not because they intend to use it, but because it is now available. And availability is enough. In workplaces, this dynamic often appears in subtle forms. A manager who is highly perceptive may notice which employees are motivated by approval, which are sensitive to criticism, which avoid conflict, and which are driven by belonging. This understanding can be used ethically to support development, to tailor communication, and to reduce unnecessary stress. It can also be used to stabilize productivity at the expense of well-being. An employee who feels deeply understood may tolerate longer hours, unclear boundaries, or misaligned responsibilities because the relational tone feels supportive. Concerns may be acknowledged verbally without being addressed structurally. Emotional validation replaces material change. The employee feels seen. The system remains unchanged. Empathy smooths the surface while outcomes remain fixed. In leadership dynamics, empathy often becomes conflated with benevolence. Leaders who are calm, emotionally articulate, and perceptive are trusted more readily. Their decisions are interpreted through a lens of assumed care. When such leaders deliver difficult outcomes, restructures, exclusions, and resource withdrawal, those affected may question their own reactions rather than the decision itself. After all, the leader understands how hard this is. Understanding becomes a buffer against challenge. The empathy does not change the impact. It changes how the impact is processed. In therapeutic or spiritual spaces, influence of empathy can be even more pronounced. These environments are explicitly oriented toward vulnerability. People arrive open, searching, and often dysregulated. They are primed to trust attunement as safety. When a practitioner, guide, or teacher is highly empathic, their insight carries authority. Interpretations feel accurate because they resonate emotionally. Language lands deeply because it mirrors internal states. This can be profoundly healing when paired with strong ethical boundaries and accountability. When those boundaries are weak, empathy itself becomes the organizing force. The client or participant defers not because they are coerced, but because the interpretation feels right. Disagreement becomes difficult. Doubt feels like resistance. Dependency can form quietly. Not because harm is intended, but because insight is not constrained by responsibility. In intimate relationships, the instrumental potential of empathy is perhaps the hardest to name because closeness is expected. Attunement is part of intimacy. Understanding another's inner world is often experienced as love, but intimacy does not eliminate asymmetry. It can intensify it. When one partner is more attuned, more perceptive, or more emotionally fluent, they may become the implicit regulator of the relationship. They sense when to withdraw, when to approach, when to soothe, and when to withhold. These adjustments can feel caring. They can also shape the other person's behavior over time. A partner who feels deeply seen may adapt more readily, concede more often, or silence certain needs to preserve coherence, not because they are pressured, but because the relationship feels meaningful, and meaning is worth protecting. Empathy lowers resistance. Attachment increases stakes. Together, they create conditions where influence can grow without intention. It is important to note that empathy becoming a tool does not require a conscious strategy. Most people who exert influence through empathy do not think of themselves as manipulative. They are often unaware of the effect they are having. Their sensitivity has simply become part of how they navigate the world. This is what makes the dynamic so difficult to confront. There is no villain to name, no clear misuse to point to, no moment where intent can be established. The influence emerges from interaction, not design. One of the reasons this pattern is rarely discussed is that it contradicts a deeply held belief that emotional intelligence is inherently ethical. But emotional intelligence, like any form of intelligence, amplifies capacity. It increases reach, it sharpens effectiveness. Without ethical constraint, increased capacity increases risk. This does not make empathy dangerous, it makes it potent. When empathy functions instrumentally, people often experience a gradual shift in agency. They may find themselves responding rather than initiating, adapting rather than expressing, waiting for cues rather than trusting their own timing. Again, this does not feel like control. It feels like cooperation. But cooperation that consistently moves in one direction creates imbalance. Language plays a quiet role here. Empathic language often mirrors emotional states, validates feelings, and contextualizes reactions. This can be deeply supportive. It can also frame reality. Phrases that sound caring can subtly define what is reasonable, what is expected, and what is excessive. Emotional responses are acknowledged, but the boundaries of acceptable action remain fixed. The person feels heard, but not empowered. Over time, this can produce a sense of passivity, not because the person lacks strength, but because the relational field has been organized around influence rather than mutuality. The key distinction is not whether empathy is present, but whether it is paired with limits. When empathy is paired with care, it introduces friction. It complicates outcomes. It requires adjustment. When empathy is unpaired, it simplifies interaction. It smooths resistance. It stabilizes direction. That stabilization can benefit systems, roles, or individuals even when it comes at a human cost. This is why empathy is often rewarded in institutional contexts without being ethically examined. It improves compliance. It reduces conflict. It increases trust. Trust in this sense does not mean safety. It means predictability. Predictable people are easier to manage. For those on the receiving end, the difficulty lies in recognizing when empathy has shifted from connection to influence, because the signals associated with harm are muted. There is no aggression, no overt control, no emotional volatility. Instead, there is reasonableness. And reasonableness is hard to argue with. Many people only recognize this pattern after distance is created. When the relational field dissolves, they notice how much they adapted. How often did they defer? How rarely outcomes shifted in their favor? They realize that empathy was present, but care was not. That understanding can be destabilizing because it challenges a foundational assumption that being seen is protective. This section is not an indictment of empathy. It is an examination of how empathy functions within power dynamics. Empathy does not collapse power. It often amplifies it. Without accountability, empathy can make influence more efficient, not more humane. In the next section, we will look more closely at the nervous system layer beneath this dynamic, at why being seen feels like safety, and how that feeling can override discernment long before conscious evaluation occurs, not to make anyone vigilant, but to restore understanding of how the body participates in influence, even when everything sounds kind. Section 5, the nervous system layer, why this feels so confusing. Confusion is often treated as a failure of thinking, as though clarity would arrive if the right questions were asked, the right information were gathered, or the right interpretation were applied. But the kind of confusion that appears in the experiences we're describing does not originate in thought. It originates in the body. Long before a person begins to doubt their interpretation, their nervous system has already made a series of assessments. Those assessments do not operate in language. They do not weigh ethics or intent. They answer a simpler question. Is this environment threatening, neutral, or settling? When someone is accurately read, when their emotional state is mirrored with precision, the nervous system often registers a decrease in threat. Muscular tension softens, breathing deepens, attention narrows less defensively. These shifts occur regardless of whether safety has actually been established over time. This is the first source of confusion. The body responds as though something protective is happening, even when no protection has yet been demonstrated. Being understood feels like safety because, historically, misunderstanding has carried risk. To be misread has meant exclusion, punishment, or neglect. To be accurately read has often preceded care. So the nervous system learns to associate attunement with relief. But association is not evaluation. The body does not ask whether the person reading you will act responsibly with what they know. It simply registers that the environment has become more predictable, less effortful, and less immediately threatening. That reduction in effort feels good, and because it feels good, it is trusted. Mirroring plays a significant role in this process. When someone mirrors tone, pacing, posture, or emotional cadence, the nervous system recognizes similarity. Similarity reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty keeps vigilance active. So similarity quiets vigilance. This is not manipulation. It is a basic regulatory mechanism. Infants rely on mirroring to learn safety. When a caregiver matches the infant's effect appropriately, the infant's system settles. Over time, this pattern becomes internalized. Being met like this means I don't have to defend. That learning does not disappear in adulthood. It simply becomes more complex. When an adult encounters someone who mirrors accurately, the same regulatory circuits are activated. The body settles first, thought follows. This sequencing matters because discernment requires a certain amount of tension. Not stress, but alertness. It requires contrast, friction, and time. When the body settles too quickly, those conditions are reduced. The mind assumes safety because the body feels regulated. But regulation is not the same as protection. This is where many people struggle to articulate what feels wrong. Their internal signals are mixed. On one level, they feel calm, seen, and coherent in the interaction. On the other hand, something is contracting over time. They may notice that after interactions, they feel tired rather than nourished, or that they replay conversations without understanding why, or that they hesitate before expressing certain needs, even though nothing overtly negative has happened. These are not cognitive failures. They are signs of a nervous system adapting to an environment where regulation is externally facilitated, but internally costly. When regulation comes primarily from being attuned to by another person rather than from mutual safety and accountability, the system becomes dependent on that attunement. It begins to organize itself around maintaining the conditions that produce calm. This can subtly shift behavior. Expression becomes selective. Conflict is softened or delayed. Boundaries are negotiated internally rather than relationally. The person is not choosing compliance. Their nervous system is choosing stability. Discernment collapses not because someone is naive, but because the body no longer signals urgency. In environments that feel overtly threatening, discernment is sharp. The system scans for exits, inconsistencies, and danger. But in environments that feel calm and attuned, those scanning behaviors are quiet. The absence of threat cues is interpreted as the presence of safety. This is efficient biology, and it is also exploitable, even unintentionally. Another source of confusion arises from the way clarity interacts with regulation. When someone understands you well, conversations tend to be coherent. Emotional narratives make sense. Interpretations feel aligned. Clarity reduces cognitive load. When cognitive load drops, the nervous system experiences relief. That relief reinforces trust in the interaction. But clarity can exist without care. And when clarity is not paired with protection, the body continues to relax while the person's agency quietly narrows. This narrowing is rarely experienced as harm. It feels like accommodation, like cooperation, like maturity, until it accumulates. The nervous system does not track fairness. It does not track mutuality, it tracks regulation. So if a dynamic reliably produces calm, even at the expense of self-expression, the body will prioritize it. This is why people often say, I don't know why I stayed so long, or I don't know why I didn't speak up sooner. The answer is not weakness, it is an adaptation. Mirroring also creates a feedback loop. When someone mirrors accurately, the person being mirrored often mirrors back unconsciously. Tone aligns, pace synchronizes, emotional expression converges. This synchrony deepens the sense of connection. It also reduces differentiation. Differentiation is what allows someone to say, this doesn't work for me, even when the relationship feels good. When synchrony is high and differentiation is low, that capacity weakens. Again, not by choice, by physiology. Another factor that contributes to confusion is the way the nervous system handles contradiction. When bodily signals say settled and cognitive signals say something is off, the system tends to prioritize the body. This is because the body's signals evolved to protect survival. So when the body feels regulated, the mind often looks for explanations that preserve that state. It rationalizes, it reframes. It downplays discomfort, not to deceive, but to maintain stability. This is why people often explain away early signs of contraction. They attribute them to stress, sensitivity, or misunderstanding, rather than to the dynamic itself. The body has already voted. It is also important to note that attunement can coexist with subtle pressure. Someone can mirror emotional states while also shaping the relational field. They can validate feelings while steering outcomes. They can recognize distress while maintaining conditions that produce it. From a nervous system perspective, this creates a bind. The source of regulation is also the source of constraint. Leaving or challenging the dynamic threatens the very calm the body has come to rely on. This is one reason why people often feel destabilized when they begin to question these relationships. Doubt itself feels unsafe, not because questioning is dangerous, but because it disrupts the regulatory pattern. The reframe that matters here is simple, but it cuts against intuition. Feeling understood is not the same as being safe. Safety requires more than accurate perception. It requires consistency over time. It requires accountability when impact occurs. It requires limits on influence. The nervous system does not automatically assess those things. It assesses immediacy. When immediacy feels calm, deeper evaluation is postponed. This is not a flaw, it is how regulation works. But when people are unaware of this sequencing, they often blame themselves for not seeing clearly. They think they should have known sooner. They should have trusted their instincts. What they miss is that their instincts were responding to attunement, not to ethics. Instincts are not moral sensors. They are survival sensors. Understanding this layer restores something important: self-trust. Not trust in judgment, but trust in the logic of the body. When people realize that their confusion emerged from regulation rather than stupidity, the narrative shifts. The experience becomes intelligible. The shame softens. They can begin to separate the feeling of calm from the question of care. This distinction does not require people to become hypervigilant or suspicious of empathy. It asks only that regulation not be mistaken for protection. When the body feels settled, it is an invitation to slow down, not to abandon discernment. Understanding why the body's settled explains the confusion, but it doesn't yet tell us whether anything was holding us there. Regulation can explain why something feels safe. It cannot tell us whether it actually was. To regain clarity, the question is not who was empathic or how accurately you were read. The question is what accompanied that empathy and what did not, because empathy can calm the nervous system without placing limits on behavior. Care does. Empathy can exist without restraint. Care cannot. Section 6. The difference between empathy and care is not a feeling. It is a pattern. This distinction matters because much of the confusion explored in this episode comes from treating care as an emotion rather than as a sustained orientation. When care is assumed to be present because empathy is visible, people rely on signals that do not actually constrain behavior. The result is not dramatic harm, but a quiet loss of internal reference, a sense that something essential was missing, even though nothing overtly wrong occurred. Empathy can be expressed in moments. Care reveals itself over time. Empathy responds, care holds. Care introduces limits. Where empathy can move freely, noticing, reflecting, resonating, care draws lines around what is permissible once another person's inner world has been accessed. It places boundaries on how insight may be used. It restrains influence when influence would cost someone else their footing. This is why care is less visible than empathy. Empathy speaks. Care often stays silent. It shows up not in what is said, but in what is consistently avoided, adjusted, or repaired. When care is present, certain options close. When care is absent, all options remain open. That difference changes everything. Care expresses itself through consistency. Not perfection, not constant availability, but reliability across time. When someone's actions align with their stated concern not once, but repeatedly, especially when doing so requires inconvenience or self-limitation, care becomes tangible. Consistency creates predictability. Predictability allows safety to accumulate. Without consistency, empathy remains episodic. It may feel powerful in the moment, but it does not stabilize the relationship. Instead, it creates peaks of connection that are not matched by structural support. This mismatch is one of the most common sources of confusion. People remember moments of deep understanding and assume they represent the whole. Care, however, is revealed in patterns, not moments. Accountability is another defining feature of care. When impact occurs, especially unintended impact, care does not stop at explanation. It does not rely solely on insight or self-awareness. It moves toward repair. Repair does not mean self-blame or emotional collapse. It means taking responsibility for how one's actions affect another person, even when those actions were reasonable, justified, or unintentional. Empathy can say, "I see how that affected you." Care asks, "What needs to change so it doesn't happen again?" This difference is subtle but decisive. Explanation without adjustment preserves influence. Adjustment introduces constraint. Responsibility for impact is where care becomes unmistakable. Care does not require someone to agree with another person's interpretation of events. It does not require constant alignment. But it does require acknowledgement that impact matters not as a matter of intention, but as a matter of consequence. When care is present, the other person's experience has weight. It shapes future behavior. It influences decisions. It limits what feels acceptable. Without this responsibility, empathy remains descriptive. It can narrate another person's pain accurately without altering the conditions that produce it. That narration can feel supportive. It can also become a substitute for change. This is where performative concern often enters the picture. Performative concern is not fake empathy. It is often sincere. It may involve genuine feeling, thoughtful language, and visible responsiveness. What distinguishes it from care is not tone, but follow through. Performative concern responds to emotion in the moment. Care reorganizes behavior over time. When concern is performative, the person offering it may appear attentive, reflective, even remorseful, yet the underlying dynamic remains unchanged. Patterns repeat. Boundaries continue to be tested. Outcomes stay the same. Empathy is real, the restraint is not. Strategic warmth operates similarly. Warmth can soothe, it can de-escalate, it can restore equilibrium after tension. In many contexts, warmth is a gift, but when warmth is used to stabilize a dynamic without addressing its effects, it becomes a regulator rather than a connector. It calms the surface while preserving the structure beneath. This does not require intention. It simply requires that warmth be easier than change. In such cases, warmth becomes a way of managing reactions rather than caring for outcomes. Emotional proximity without protection is another marker of empathy unpaired with care. Emotional proximity involves closeness, shared language, shared insight, and shared emotional space. It can feel intimate and affirming. But without protection, that proximity exposes vulnerabilities without safeguarding them. Protection does not mean control. It means consideration. It means that knowing someone's sensitivities leads to gentler handling, not greater access. That awareness narrows options rather than expanding them. When emotional proximity increases access but not protection, people often feel overexposed rather than supported, though they may struggle to articulate why. Care constrains behavior. This is perhaps the simplest and most important distinction. Care limits what someone is willing to do once they know how it will land. It introduces friction into decision-making. It slows momentum. It creates pauses where efficiency might otherwise prevail. This is why care can feel costly. It asks someone to give up certain advantages, speed, leverage, clarity, or control to preserve another person's orientation. Empathy alone does not ask this. Empathy can coexist with efficiency. Care often interrupts it. Because care is constraining, it is less common in systems that reward outcomes over impact. It is harder to maintain where speed, productivity, or coherence are prioritized above human cost. This is why people often encounter empathy without care in professional, institutional, or hierarchical contexts. Insight is valued, emotional intelligence is praised, but accountability for relational impact is diffuse. No one individual intends harm. No one feels responsible for the repair. The system moves on. At the interpersonal level, this distinction becomes personal. People who have relied on empathy as a signal of safety may realize, in retrospect, that what they were responding to was not care, but attunement. They trusted understanding where responsibility was absent. This recognition can feel destabilizing because it challenges a deeply held assumption that being seen protects us. When that assumption falls away, people may grieve not just the relationship, but the framework they use to navigate connection. It is important to emphasize that care is not the same as constant accommodation. Care does not require someone to meet every need, agree with every feeling, or avoid all conflict. In fact, care often involves saying no, setting limits, and allowing discomfort. But when care says no, it does so with awareness of impact. It does not use insight to bypass or minimize another person's experience. Care can tolerate tension. Empathy without care often avoids it. Another way to recognize care is through repair attempts that persist even when they are inconvenient. When care is present, someone does not rely on being understood to move on. They are willing to revisit, reflect, and adjust, even when it disrupts flow or challenges self-image. When care is absent, repair may be offered once, verbally or symbolically, but not structurally. The relationship returns to baseline without transformation. This can create a sense of déjà vu for the person on the receiving end. They recognize the pattern intellectually, but feel unable to shift it. Care also shows up in how power is handled. When someone holds more influence, emotionally, socially, or professionally, care requires them to manage the asymmetry consciously. It asks them to consider how their words, decisions, or presence shape the other person's options. Empathy can recognize asymmetry. Care acts on that recognition. Without care, power remains unexamined. Insight simply makes the exercise smoother. This is where many people feel the quiet injury of absence rather than attack. They were not harmed through cruelty. They were not dismissed or ignored. They were engaged but not protected. And because protection is harder to see than engagement, the injury can take time to register. Understanding this distinction restores internal reference. Instead of asking, "Was I misread?" the question becomes, "Was I held?" Instead of evaluating empathy, people begin to look for patterns of constraint, for moments where insight led to limitation rather than expansion. This shift is subtle, but it is grounding. It moves the focus away from analyzing another person's intentions and toward recognizing what was structurally present or absent in the dynamic. Care does not need to be intense. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to be perfect. But it does need to be consistent, accountable, and responsive to impact. Without those elements, empathy remains unbound. This section does not ask people to distrust empathy. It asks them not to outsource safety to perception alone. Empathy tells you what someone can see. Care tells you what they will protect. When those two are confused, people often abandon themselves quietly, believing they are aligned when they are accommodating. Recognizing the difference allows them to stop doing that without blaming anyone and without turning suspicion into a way of life. In the next section, we will explore why this pattern is so hard to name, why it often lacks the features people associate with harm, and why self-doubt becomes the most common response, not to justify the experience but to make sense of it. Section 7. Why this pattern is so hard to name. One of the most destabilizing aspects of the experiences explored in this episode is not what happened, but how difficult it is to describe what happened. People often know something was wrong long before they can articulate why. They carry a sense of diminishment, a loss of orientation, or a quiet erosion of confidence, yet when they try to explain it, the words fail them. The experience does not conform to the familiar narratives of harm. There is no obvious cruelty to point to, no clear breach, no moment that unequivocally signals this crossed a line. This absence of recognizable markers is precisely what makes the pattern so hard to name. In many forms of relational harm, distress announces itself loudly. There may be volatility, contradiction, emotional intensity, or overt control. These dynamics create confusion, chaos, and cognitive dissonance. People feel destabilized, but they also feel justified in that destabilization. The harm is visible enough to validate their response. The pattern explored here does not operate that way. Instead of chaos, there is coherence. Instead of confusion, there is clarity. Instead of overt cruelty, there is reasonableness. And reasonableness is disarming. When people look back on these experiences, they often say something like, "Nothing sounds bad when I explain it." They may describe conversations that were calm, thoughtful, and emotionally literate. They may recall being listened to, understood, and spoken to with care in tone, even when the outcome was painful or diminishing. There may be no raised voices, no dismissive language, no obvious manipulation. Because of this, self-doubt becomes the dominant response. If nothing sounds bad, perhaps nothing was bad. If the other person seemed reasonable, perhaps the discomfort was an overreaction. If everything made sense, perhaps the problem lies in interpretation rather than in the dynamic itself. This is not irrational thinking. It is an attempt to reconcile an experience that lacks dramatic evidence. Another reason this pattern is hard to name is that it often lacks confusion. In earlier episodes, we explored how certain dynamics destabilize perception by creating contradiction, gaslighting, or emotional whiplash. Those patterns leave people disoriented because reality itself feels unstable. Here, reality remains stable, the explanations are coherent, the narratives align, the logic holds. And because logic holds, people assume safety. But safety is not the same as sense-making. It is possible for something to make sense and still be harmful. This distinction is rarely taught. Clarity is often mistaken for health. When conversations are articulate and emotionally informed, people assume the relationship or environment is functioning well. Emotional fluency is treated as evidence of maturity. Calmness is taken as proof of care. So when harm occurs in such contexts, people struggle to reconcile it with what they've been taught to look for. They think harm should feel dramatic. They think it should come with obvious malice or disregard. They think it should provoke anger, fear, or confusion. When none of that appears, they conclude that perhaps harm did not occur at all. This is where the injury becomes internalized. Because the experience does not match cultural templates for harm, people turn the question inward. They begin to scrutinize their own sensitivity, expectations, and reactions. They ask, am I being unreasonable? Did I misinterpret this? Why does this affect me so much if nothing bad happened? These questions do not arise because the person lacks insight. They arise because the experience lacks a name. Another factor that contributes to this difficulty is that the harm often comes from absence, not action. Nothing was said that should not have been said. Nothing was done that clearly violated a boundary. Instead, something that should have happened did not. Care did not arrive. Protection did not follow insight. Responsibility did not constrain behavior. Absence is harder to name than presence. It leaves no evidence. This is why people often struggle to explain the impact to others. Friends may respond with confusion or minimization. They may say, that doesn't sound so bad, or at least they listened, or it seems like they cared. These responses, while often well-intentioned, deepen the sense of isolation. If others cannot see the harm, perhaps it was not real. If others would have felt fine in the same situation, perhaps the issue is personal. This social invalidation compounds the original experience. The harm didn't feel like harm, but almost clinical. This word appears frequently in people's descriptions, even if they don't use it explicitly. The experience lacks messiness. There is no obvious conflict to process, no emotional explosion to recover from. Instead, the person is left with a quiet sense of having been reduced. Clean harm leaves no debris, no obvious wound, no clear aftermath, but it still alters how a person relates to themselves. Because the harm is clean, it resists memory in the usual way. There are no moments that replay vividly, no arguments to revisit, no phrases that echo sharply. Instead, there is a general sense of contraction. People may notice they have become less expressive, less spontaneous, more cautious, but they cannot easily point to when or why. This makes healing feel elusive because there is nothing concrete to resolve. Another reason this pattern is hard to name is that it does not require malicious intent. Many people are looking for intent as a way to validate their experience. They want to know whether the other person meant harm, whether there was strategy or manipulation involved. But harm does not require intention. Impact is not dependent on motive. When harm occurs through absence, through lack of care, lack of restraint, lack of accountability, intent becomes irrelevant. What matters is what was not provided when it was needed. This is a difficult truth because it removes the comfort of clear blame. Without a villain, people feel uncertain about their right to feel hurt. They think, if no one meant to harm me, do I get to be affected? If this was unintentional, am I overreacting? If they didn't know better, should I just accept it? These questions place the burden back on the person who was impacted. And because the dynamic was not dramatic, they often answer those questions by minimizing their own experience. This is where the reframing matters. The injury here is relational, not dramatic. It does not announce itself through crisis. It accumulates quietly through adaptation. People do not feel attacked, they feel unheld. And that distinction is crucial. When harm comes from an attack, the nervous system mobilizes. It prepares to defend, flee, or fight. When harm comes from absence, the system often does the opposite. It contracts. It adapts. It becomes smaller to maintain a connection. This contraction is not a failure. It is a survival response. But when it persists, it reshapes identity. The damage here is not about what was done. It is about what was consistently missing. Missing restraint, missing repair, missing protection. And because those things are subtle, people struggle to articulate them. They know something eroded, but they cannot point to a single event that caused it. This is why naming often comes late. Only after distance, reflection, or comparison do people begin to recognize that what they experienced was not mutuality, but accommodation. Not care, but attunement without responsibility. By then, the damage may already have been internalized. Normalizing self-doubt is an essential part of restoring orientation. Self-doubt is not evidence that nothing happened. It is evidence that something happened without the markers people are taught to trust. When harm is reasonable, calm, and coherent, doubt is the natural response. Understanding this helps people stop interrogating their own reactions. They no longer need to prove that harm occurred. They no longer need to justify their discomfort. They no longer need to explain why it was bad enough. The question shifts, not was this abusive, but was I held? And if the answer is no, that information matters regardless of intent, tone, or explanation. This reframing also prevents the opposite error, over-pathologizing. When people cannot name harm, they sometimes reach for extreme labels to make sense of their experience. This can bring temporary clarity, but it often introduces fear, rigidity, and further confusion. Understanding the role of absence allows people to acknowledge impact without creating enemies. It restores nuance. The pattern is hard to name because it lives in the space between harm and care, between safety and threat, between connection and autonomy. It does not fit existing categories, but difficulty naming does not make it unreal. It makes it subtle. In the next section, we will move out of explanation and into observation, not to diagnose or analyze, but to notice simple signals that distinguish empathy from care in lived interactions. Section 8, Observation Practice. Empathy signals versus care signals. Up to this point, the work of this episode has been descriptive rather than directive. It is focused on understanding how certain dynamics form, why they feel the way they do, and why they are so difficult to name. This section continues in that spirit. It is not a practice designed to fix anything. It is not a method for protecting yourself. It is not a tool for identifying others. It is simply an invitation to notice, not to conclude, not to gather evidence, not to build a case, just to notice what is already happening. One of the risks when people begin to understand subtle relational patterns is that awareness turns into vigilance. They start scanning interactions for danger, analyzing every exchange, or holding others at a distance out of fear of being influenced again. That is not the purpose here. The aim of this observation practice is the opposite, to restore ease and internal reference without tightening the nervous system, to replace confusion with orientation, not suspicion. Noticing is different from monitoring. Noticing is receptive, not defensive. The distinction between empathy and care is not something that can be resolved in a single moment. It reveals itself over time, through patterns rather than incidents. This is why observation, rather than confrontation, is the appropriate response. Care does not need to be demanded. It needs to be recognized. As you move through daily interactions, professional, relational, and casual, you may begin to notice moments where insight is present. Someone understands your emotional state accurately. They respond in ways that feel attuned. Conversation flows. There is a sense of being met. There is no need to question this. Empathy is not the problem. The invitation here is simply to notice what happens after insight appears. One question to hold lightly is, who benefits from the insight? This is not about judging intent. It is about observing direction. When insight enters the interaction, does it primarily support mutual adjustment, or does it stabilize outcomes that favor one side? Does understanding lead to shared movement, or does it make it easier for things to continue as they already are? Sometimes the benefit is shared. Sometimes it is not. Noticing that difference does not require action. It simply restores clarity. Another point of observation is, who adapts? Adaptation is not inherently negative. Healthy relationships involve mutual flexibility. People adjust to one another all the time. But adaptation that consistently moves in one direction becomes informative. You might notice that after being understood, you are the one who softens, reframes, or lets go. You may find yourself adjusting expectations, needs, or boundaries in order to preserve coherence. Again, this is not something to correct. It is something to see. When adaptation becomes one-sided, care is often absent, even when empathy is present. A third question to notice is, who carries responsibility after harm? Harm here does not mean dramatic injury. It means impact, moments where something lands heavily, creates contraction, or requires repair. When impact occurs, who holds it? Does responsibility move toward the person with more influence, or does it drift back toward the person who was affected? Is the repair structural, or does it remain verbal? Does anything actually change? Care reveals itself in this moment. Empathy may acknowledge the impact. Care reorganizes behavior around it. These questions are not meant to be answered definitively. They are not checklists. They are lenses that bring certain patterns into focus without forcing interpretation. You may notice that in some relationships, empathy and care travel together. Insight leads to protection. Understanding produces adjustment. Influence is constrained by responsibility. In others, empathy appears without care. Insight flows freely. The dynamic remains unchanged. Responsibility quietly shifts away from the person with influence. Both patterns exist. Noticing them does not require response. It is important to emphasize the rules of this practice because they protect against misapplication. There is no diagnosing here, no labeling, no categorizing of people. Diagnosis turns observation into judgment. That is not the aim. There is no confrontation, no challenging others based on what you notice. Confrontation moves the nervous system into defense. This work is about restoring regulation, not escalating conflict. There is no storytelling, no building narratives about what something means. Stories solidify too quickly. They close curiosity. They create certainty where ambiguity still holds useful information. Just noticing. Noticing can feel deceptively passive, but it is not. It restores something fundamental. the ability to remain present without abandoning yourself. When people lose trust in their perception, they often overcompensate. They either defer completely or become hyperanalytical. Both responses move them away from embodied clarity. Observation sits in the middle. It allows information to accumulate without forcing resolution. This kind of noticing also changes how time is experienced. Rather than reacting to individual moments, people begin to sense patterns across weeks or months. They notice what repeats, what resolves, and what never quite changes. Care is revealed in repetition. Is its absence. Another subtle shift that often occurs through observation is a change in internal pacing. When people stop rushing to interpret or respond, they create space for their own nervous system to settle independently of others' attunement. This restores autonomy, not by withdrawing but by slowing. It is also worth noting that noticing does not require withdrawal from relationships or environments. You do not need to distance yourself from others to observe clearly. In fact, distance can sometimes obscure patterns. Observation works best when you remain engaged, but less invested in immediate coherence. Over time, this practice often leads to a quiet recalibration. People stop relying on empathy as a proxy for safety. They begin to look for care in behavior rather than in tone. They notice where responsibility consistently lands. This does not make them guarded. It makes them oriented. Orientation is not certain. It is not knowing what to do. It is knowing where you are. When orientation returns, choices become clearer without being urgent. This section does not conclude with instruction or advice because none is required. Noticing on its own is enough. It restores internal reference. It softens self-doubt. It reduces the need for explanation. And it does so without turning awareness into alarm. In the final sections of this episode, we will bring this work to a close not by resolving it, but by integrating it, with a single reflection prompt. And a reminder that the goal is not to see danger everywhere, but to recognize the moments where you quietly disappear and choose not to. Section 9, Self-Reflection Prompt. This episode has moved slowly and deliberately, not to reach a conclusion and not to arrive at certainty, but to restore orientation, the quiet sense of where you are in relation to yourself. Before we move toward integration and closing, there is a single reflection to sit with. It is not a task. It is not a request for insight. It does not require an answer. It is simply an invitation to notice what arises when the question is allowed to land. The question is this: where have I mistaken being understood for being held? There is no need to search your past, no need to review relationships, no need to analyze specific moments. If something surfaces, let it surface. If nothing does, that is also information. This reflection is not about fault, yours or anyone else's. It is not about reassessing people or reinterpreting experiences through a new lens. It is about gently contacting a pattern that may have shaped how you relate, adapt, or stay quiet. You are not being asked to judge what you find, only to recognize it. Often, what emerges is not a story, but a sensation, a memory of contraction, a familiar pause before speaking, a moment where you adjusted, softened, or stepped back, not because you were asked to, but because it felt easier. That noticing is enough. You do not need to resolve it. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to decide what it means. This reflection is not here to prompt action. It is here to restore contact. Contact with the difference between being seen and being supported, between being recognized and being protected, between coherence and care. If you feel nothing, trust that too. If you feel unsettled, allow it to pass without interpretation. The aim is not to produce insight. It is to make space for something quieter. The return of internal reference. We'll bring the episode to a close next, not by concluding, but by integrating what's already been noticed. Section 10, Integration and Closing. Orientation, not resolution. There is a temptation at the end of an episode like this to tie everything together neatly, to summarize, to explain, to provide reassurance or direction. But the work of this episode does not lend itself to resolution in that way, and it was never meant to. What has been explored here is not a problem to be solved, but a pattern to be recognized. Not a category to be learned, but a distinction to be felt. The purpose of this closing is not to give answers, but to help what you've already noticed settle into place. One of the quiet myths this episode has been gently dismantling is the idea that harm must announce itself clearly to be real. Many people carry the belief, often unconsciously, that if something was truly damaging, it would have been obvious. There would have been cruelty, volatility, raised voices, clear violations, something undeniable. When none of those things are present, people assume they must be mistaken. But the most effective forms of influence do not rely on force or intensity. They rely on reasonableness, on coherence, on emotional fluency. They unfold slowly, relationally, and often without dramatic moments to point to. They feel clean. This cleanliness is part of what makes them difficult to trust. Another myth this episode has quietly challenged is the idea that empathy, by itself, is a safeguard. Empathy is powerful. It reduces threat. It lowers defenses. It increases access. and because of that, it is often mistaken for care. But empathy is not an ethic. It is not a commitment. It does not, on its own, place limits on behavior. Care does. Care is what constrains influence. Care is what introduces responsibility for impact. Care is what turns insight into protection rather than leverage. Without care, empathy remains unbound, and unbound capacities, however gentle they appear, shape outcomes. This episode has not been about exposing others. It has been about restoring something internal. Many people who encounter the dynamics described here do not feel anger first. They feel doubt. They wonder whether they are overreacting, whether they misunderstood, whether they should have been clearer, stronger, or more discerning. This self-questioning is not a flaw. It is a predictable response to harm that lacks the usual markers people rely on to validate their experience. When harm comes from absence rather than attack, doubt is often the first response. Understanding that is not about assigning blame. It is about relieving shame. If there is one thing to carry forward from this episode, it is not a new label or framework, but a simple orientation shift. Instead of asking, "Did they understand me?" the question becomes, "Was I held?" Instead of analyzing empathy, attention moves to care. Care shows itself in consistency, in accountability, in responsibility for impact over time. It shows up not in moments of insight, but in patterns of restraint. This distinction does not require vigilance. It does not require people to harden, withdraw, or second-guess every interaction. It simply asks that regulation not be mistaken for protection, and that clarity not be confused with care. Feeling calm is not the same as being safe. Feeling understood is not the same as being held. Recognizing that difference allows people to stop abandoning themselves quietly in the hope of maintaining coherence. There is also an important boundary to name here. This episode is not suggesting that every instance of empathy without care is harmful. Not all relationships are meant to carry responsibility. Not all interactions require protection. Context matters. What matters is not perfection, but pattern. Care is not proven by intention. It is revealed by repetition. As this episode comes to a close, there is no instruction to act, no behavior to change, no conclusion to draw. If something resonated, let it settle. If nothing did, trust that too. Orientation does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it comes later, quietly, unexpectedly, when a familiar situation feels different, simply because you are noticing it from a steadier place. Debunking one last myth before closing, it's worth naming one final assumption that often lingers beneath these experiences. If someone caused harm, they must have felt something about it. This belief can keep people stuck for a long time. In reality, some systems and some dynamics function precisely because feeling is not required. Not because people are cruel, but because responsibility is diffused and care is not structurally necessary for things to continue. Harm does not always leave an emotional trace in the person who caused it. That does not make the harm unreal. The danger explored in this episode is not that some people lack empathy, conscience, or care. The greater danger is that we build relational and institutional environments where care is optional, where insight is rewarded, but responsibility is not required. When that happens, people adapt. They accommodate. They contract. Not because they are weak, but because they are human. In the next episode, we'll move into a closely related but distinct territory. Episode 5, Spiritual Language and Psychological Injury, where meaning replaces safety, where harm becomes reframed as growth, and where language intended to liberate can quietly override discernment. Until then, there's nothing you need to do. Just notice what holds and what doesn't. This work is not about seeing danger everywhere. It is about recognizing the moments you disappear and choosing not to. You've been listening to Invisible Hands, Manipulation, Power, and the Fracturing of Perception. I'm James Miller.